you know, very serious.
Right, I
They don't know
remember.
her yet.
So,
They just are
He's
just like,
saying,
so we were kind of friends with him, so she passed away. I like the rustic, especially looking, it didn't look the same, they were modern, and it actually has pictures of the old house.
no, so before Christmas, Green Mill, now there's somebody really good there.
Oh, I love the green mill.
Soul Machine?
What?
At Green Mill this
and then he's just sitting there.
and, not Dale Tarts, but that other one, the other jazz club, what's that one called? Right in, Streeterville.
Winters Jazz Club?
Winters, yeah, yeah. We were there this fall. In Winters? Oh, you didn't go. And then the Green Mill. Who's at the Green Mill? Soul Machine?
We don't do that.
This weekend. Wow.
I'm gonna see Williams and Taylor.
Oh.
School.
Yeah. That's a blast from the past.
Are they out of town?
Girl, yeah.
How could I not, I saw him coming up and I got it. Livingston and Janice Ian is gonna be there too.
But she's ill.
You know her?
Well, you know, every once in a while, still, but, Old Town School of Music. They was a really big scene.
Really?
Oh my God, like 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it was like, what? It was so crazy. It was somebody like Santana or something. Yeah.
So can you like get on their notification list?
Yeah, you have to do that, yeah.
The funny thing about it is, we talk about a small world, you know, initially I got my tickets, and they had my old address, my old phone number, they don't give anything up. They knew exactly my whole history of the past.
Oh, that is
They
hilarious.
said, you live at 338 West Armitage Street.
Funny.
Does your husband run?
Well, I have some relatives and cousins in Wisconsin, and all during COVID, they took classes just like mine at Old Town School of Music, ukulele, and a whole bunch of stuff. They had
What are the classes there?
Yeah, they had,
Cocktail?
Yeah, I got my cocktail.
which one did you end up getting?
The White Lion.
The White Lion.
Yeah. We can get an extra sheet for Sharon. But that's a wonderful place to go.
Yeah.
And it's right off, I found out the G26.
Well, isn't there two? One's kind of suburban, and then there's the original.
All of the good stuff in the old town.
Right.
And it's right off the Brown Line.
Yeah, I'm just taking it off.
You have to get off on Lincoln.
Oh, it's one of those.
We have a request.
What? Oh yeah, we'll do it later. I got in the littlest is Taylor, I can't wait to see you and Janice Ian.
Yeah.
I got a
Somebody's
try.
really good at like
I set up, let's see if you see, I just posted a paper machete
Go for it.
for February 19th.
I didn't see that one.
And nobody's seeing it.
No, I was just.
I wonder if I didn't publish it.
I don't think I saw it.
All right, for our live audience, people who are actually here, please feel free to grab a seat. Make sure you silence your cell phone, something we used to do in movie theaters, if you guys remember movie theaters. We will get started here in 2 minutes for anyone watching online or in person. I'll awkwardly hold this mic.
Tell a 2-minute joke.
Two-minute joke? I don't
Sing
know.
a 2-minute song. You know.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you're tuning in virtually, hello. If you're actually here in person, thank you so much for getting vaccinated. We are a history organization, and vaccines work, and we suffer no fools. So please come attend our events in person once you've been fully vaccinated against COVID-19, polio, syphilis, and the works. A number of other diseases we no longer have. smallpox, measles. Actually, measles is coming back. All right. Well, without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started. For any of you who don't know me, my name is Patty. Believe it or not, 6 years ago, I started this organization to give walking tours. It has been a pretty crazy 6 years since we lost 2 of them entirely. So I can't tell you guys how much it means to me that you're all here. We took a really big gamble by not being able to do our signature events for 2 years, and the fact that you're all here, you showed up, you're watching online, I can't tell you how much it means to me. Thank you for hanging in there. Thanks for tuning in to our virtual lectures. Again, thanks for getting vaccinated. Thank you for being here. Give yourselves a round of applause. We are hopefully almost all the way through this. As a friendly reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are a fully legal nonprofit in the eyes of the law. And therefore, if you have some money to give, we have many ways to take it. We can take cash, check, credit card, Venmo. You can give us your firstborn child. We'll take anything. We are an all-volunteer organization. We exist by Chicagoans, for Chicagoans, and our mission statement is exactly that. We want to make history accessible to everyone. We want it to be free to anybody who can't afford the price of admission, and that's why all of our events are pay what you can. So if you can, please give. If you can't, no worries, homie. Just keep coming to events and learning about your city. We do have punch cards available. You can pick one up in person or email me and I'll mail you one. When you fill out those punch cards, you may have forgotten them over the years, but when you fill it out, when you come to 6 events, you actually get a free artist print, limited edition, which I will mail to you in 2 to 8 weeks, depending on whether or not my post office is open. And I think that covers most of the business. Our lecture series is our first night, so forgive us for any technical difficulties, and if you're here in person, you won't have any. We're very, very excited. The theme this year is Chicago Obscura. Basically, all of our speakers are really intense nerds about Chicago history, and they had 2 years to read books. So I let them propose any topic they wanted, and this is going to be a really fun dive into really unique elements of Chicago history. Our full lineup's on our website. Please sign up, come in person, watch online. We're really excited to have you guys here. And without further ado, I think I've said that 10 times. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Walter Kiefer. He is an exceptional historian, an incredibly detailed researcher, who's done lots of events with us in the past. He's kind of the planes, trains, and automobiles industrial type historian. Boats too, I suppose. Yeah. So I'm going to let him take it away. We're going to talk all tonight about aviation in Chicago.
All right. Cool. So put this back here.
All right. This is good? Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Sweet.
All right.
Let's put this right here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Patty, and Chicago for Chicagoans for having me back here, for inviting me to speak about one of my favorite topics, which is aviation. I think this is my 3rd time speaking with Chicago for Chicagoans now.
Plus a bunch of tours.
Plus a bunch of Lakeview, bunch of tours. I've done the Lakeview History Tour a few times. As you can see from my shirt, I did work at NASA back in the day in the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm from. So I'm a big aviation and space nerd, so when I suggested this topic and Patty accepted it, I was just super excited because I just love talking about, aircraft. And you think Chicago is more of a, you think about the canals, think about the railroads, Great Lakes shipping, you don't really think about planes so much. So I thought it was somewhat more of an obscure topic, which kind of matches pretty well with the Chicago Obscura theme of the lectures for this year. So it turns out that Chicago actually was the center of the aviation world, at least in the United States, during the beginnings of powered flight, meaning from 1903, from when the Wright Brothers first flew, to the outbreak of the First World War. So 4 aircraft, that is. So people had been flying in blimps and dirigibles since the 1850s, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus on Chicago's early role in heavier-than-air aircraft and the aviators that flew them and the airports that served them. Sound good? Okay, good. So as you can see, I've got a couple friends here. This is the Wright Flyer from 1903, little Christmas ornament. My girlfriend actually just got me this yesterday, so that was good timing. So this will be a fun little prop.
Can you show it this way
Sure.
for the old folks over
Yeah, I'll just kind of, this is the Wright Flyer there. I'll just kind of set this here. And this is the United 787 Dreamliner, which is the most technically advanced aircraft in the world today, at least for civilian aircraft. So this is kind of like, you know, where it started, where we're going, kind of like, and then there's just a whole lot of history in between these two. So, all right. So show of hands, who has heard of Octave Chanute? Is that a name that's familiar to anybody? Not so much? Okay. Who has heard of the Wright Brothers? Everybody. Okay, cool. So we're going to correct that, because Octave Chanute should be as famous as the Wright Brothers. So if you have the visual aids in front of you, and if you're online, I think there's a link to the slides if you wish to check out the visuals. The picture there on the first slide is Octave Chanute, and next to that is the frieze at the U.S. Capitol building, which features on it from left to right Leonardo da Vinci, Samuel Langley, who was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Octave Chanute or next to him, and the Wright Brothers, Wilbur and Orville. So why is Octave Chanute up there with Leonardo da Vinci, the Wright Brothers, and Samuel Langley? Well, Octave Chanute was a civil engineer who moved to Illinois in 1853 at the age of 21. His first job was as a surveyor for the Chicago and Alton Railroad. 2 years later, he was hired as the chief engineer for the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad, laying tracks from Peoria to the Indiana state line. But Chanute had bigger aspirations for his engineering talent. When the railroads got together and put out proposals in 1865 for the Union Stockyards in Chicago, Chanute's design was the winning entry out of 14 submissions. So he was named chief engineer of the stockyards and supervised the construction. So that involved the construction of what was called the Chicago Junction Railroad. This connected the 9 railroads that entered into the stockyards and served them. He also built a dam to bring water into the stockyards, and which would also take wastewater back out into the south branch of the Chicago River, which became, unfortunately, Bubbly Creek. Maybe if you had known, you might have designed it a little bit better so it wasn't so polluted. But, so the Boston investors who owned the Peoria Railroad wanted an uninterrupted transcontinental railroad to the Pacific Ocean, which was complete in 1869 with the Golden Spike ceremony in Utah. But you still had to use a ferry to cross the Missouri River, so it wasn't really a continuous transcontinental railroad. So the Missouri River, which they called the Wild Missouri, was thought to be completely unbridgeable. So Octave Chanute was chosen to actually design the first railroad bridge over that river, which was called the Hannibal Bridge. And I believe I have a picture of that on the second slide. So if you take a look at the bridge there, not only did he make it functional, spanning the river successfully, he also made it beautiful. So there's really cool decoration on the trusses, and the piers are made out of blue limestone. So he put a lot of work into making it aesthetically beautiful as well as functional. So if you take a look at the truss, that's actually going to figure prominently because that's called a Pratt truss. So a Pratt truss is one in which the vertical members of the bridge take compression, and then the diagonal members, which are a little bit thinner, take the tension. And if you take a look at the Wright Flyer here, a little bit small, if you take a look, it's the same design. You've got the vertical, you have this is the biplane, 2 wings, and in between the 2 wings, there's a truss. It's the same thing, the Pratt truss, with the vertical posts here for the compression, and then these diagonal guide wires taking the tension. This is what the Wright Brothers used, and this came right out of Octave Chanute's design. So the bridge won accolades and made Octave Chanute famous. The Western Home Journal from Lawrence, Kansas wrote that the bridge is the most splendid triumph of engineering genius of the age. It was considered a greater engineering feat than bridging the Mississippi River, and transformed Kansas City into a railroad hub along with the Kansas City stockyards, which Chanute also designed. So another big problem of the day was how to maintain wooden structures and to prevent them from rotting or cracking. So Chanute, being a good engineer, was always trying to think of ways to improve things. So this led to his invention of procedures for pressure treating railroad ties and telephone poles with something called creosote. So creosote is a tar derived from coal. The technique is still used today. He also invented this procedure of date stamping of ties with numbered nails. They're called date nails. There's also a picture of that on the slide. So that's not used today, but if you walk along an old abandoned railroad track and you happen to see one of these nails with a number on it, try to pick it up because they're super collectible. Railroad collectors just go nuts for that sort of thing. And when I first learned about this, I thought, man, Patty's going to love this because she's all about these if you walk along the sidewalk, you'll see every once in a while there might be a date stamp on there that says this company made this sidewalk in this year. So it's the same thing, but for sidewalks. So the date nail, same thing for the railroads. So just keep an eye out. If you find one, it's collectible. It's worth a lot of money. The company he founded for this creosoting technique was what basically made him rich. So he's able to basically retire from the railroad industry at this point and then turn his attention to other things. So Chanute, after that, became the chief engineer for the Illinois Central, which is what brought him to Chicago in 1889. So then, at this point, he was basically financially successful, and then he could turn his attention to aviation, which was his next interest. So in the 1890s, the idea of manned flight was a huge no-no. If man was meant to fly, God would have given him wings, right? So only, crackpots worked on flying machines. It was just something that, serious people didn't work on. So when Chanute turns attention to the problem of flight, there was really no reputable journals of any sort on the topic. But because he was nationally respected as an engineer because of his bridge building work, he believed he could turn his engineering skills from bridge building, such as stress analysis, truss design, strength of materials, the effect of winds, to the problem of flight, and people would start to take it seriously. The quote was that the solution of the problem of sailing safely through the air has been considered so impracticable that the study of the subject was considered an indication of lunacy. So during the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, Chanute chaired an international conference on aerial navigation. So it wasn't part of the expo, but it was during the World's Fair, and he thought this was a good time to do this because this is when the entire world was focusing on Chicago. So more than 300 engineers came from around the world to come share their experiments, including Samuel Langley, the first secretary of the Smithsonian. In his opening address, Chanute said, "It is well to recognize that we have met here for an unusual subject, one in which commercial success has not been discerned and in which the public has little interest and still less confidence." So the conference was a huge success in breaking down the problem of flight into its component parts and then eliminating the errors of previous experiments and making known the successful ones. So he was able to bring all these people together, have them share their work in a forum where they wouldn't be laughed at, and have people say, "This is what I tried and it worked, and this is what I tried and it didn't work." So he analyzed all these experiments and published them in results in a very important book for aviation in 1884, which was called The Progress in Flying Machines. So in this book, he formalized terms that would become standard, like aeroplane, lift, and drag. Those are all his terms that he invented. He determined that a successful flying machine would need several elements: an airframe, lift, power, control, the ability to fly level and stable, and the means to take off and land. He also predicted planes would eventually fly over 100 miles per hour and that their first application would be in war. In 1896, Chanute hired two assistants named William Avery and Augustus Herring and headed to the Indiana Dunes by Lake Michigan to begin their experiments with gliders. So Chanute knew from his experience designing bridges and railroads that you had to start from what you knew, and only through doing experiments separate fact from error. All right, so what was known about flight before Chanute? So the next slide here, I've included 6 pictures of attempts at aircraft that preceded Octave Chanute, and they all look pretty kind of ridiculous by today's standards. Some are kind of more practical than others, but I just wanted to include these because it shows kind of how wide open the field of aviation was. Nobody had any idea of what an aircraft should look like, what kind of power source should it have flapping wings, should it have stationary wings, should it have multiple wings, should it have gas that's layered in air for it to float. Nobody had any idea. So you have Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter. So an ornithopter means an aircraft that flaps its wings like a bird. People tried that. George Cayley was an English scientist who experimented with gliders in the 1850s. So he had a glider here with like a bag that would hold hot air, similar to a hot air balloon with a tail behind it. Thomas Moy's aerial steamer, I include this one because it just looks ridiculous by today's standards. But this one had a steam engine on it. The Sesquiplane plane from 1883 here, I just love this picture because it's just so like 1880s. It just, it definitely capitalizes on the bicycle craze of the time because here's a guy, pedaling the wheels as if it were a bicycle to turn the propeller.
Did it get off the ground?
No, did not get off the ground.
What happens if your legs got tired? Oops, that's...
So, I mean, yeah, some of these were able to fly briefly, so they were making progress very slowly but surely. Otto Lilienthal here is very important. He was a German experimenter in gliders. He developed a glider by 1894 that he called the Standard and was really the first that could reliably achieve manned flight over long distances. So because of Lilienthal's work, The public and scientific audiences began to believe that flight was not only possible but also practical. So as you can see, it has more of a bat-like wing, and the steering was achieved by shifting the weight, so it didn't have any sort of control mechanism to speak of. He died in 1896, and what happened was his glider pitched up and stalled, and then it ended up plunging 50 feet to his death. So his dying words were, "Sacrifices must be made." So he's a very, very brave man. Yeah. And the last one included here is the Aerodrome, number 5 of Samuel Langley. So Langley, he was involved with the Smithsonian, he was their first secretary, and he got a huge grant from the federal government to design his models, which he called aerodromes, 2 of which successfully flew without a pilot. So they were launched basically from a catapult in the Potomac River and flew for about a mile, without a pilot on board with no control mechanism. After this, he did try to attempt 2 piloted flights. Both of them launched from the catapult in the Potomac River and promptly slammed in the Potomac River, with the pilot on board almost killing him. A little funny postscript to that story. Glenn Curtis, who ended up becoming the Wright Brothers' main rival, took the aerodrome after the fact and made a whole bunch of changes to it and actually successfully flew it and said, "Ha, you see, the aerodrome did beat the Wright Brothers. He flew before the Wrights." To which the Wright Brothers said, "No, you made a whole bunch of changes to make it flight worthy, then you flew it." So.
If you guys have a pamphlet, please circulate it so other people can see too.
Yep. Helps to have the visual in front of you. The other thing I'll point out about the aerodrome here is that even though the wings look pretty close to modern wings, if you look at the propellers, and it's kind of a small picture, but if you look at the propellers, they're really nothing more. It's really nothing more than a paddle, like a ship's paddle, placed on the engine. So people really at the time were thinking in terms of ships. An airplane is just merely a ship that sails through the air. We can put a ship's paddle on it as a propeller, and they can just steer through the air just like a ship does. They really didn't conceive of the airplane being a completely new device that had its own sort of set of physics. All right, so back to Chanute. Turn the page here. So in 1896, that's what Chanute was. That's what he knew up to this point. That's what had been done. Some people had some success. Some people didn't have some success. And he was the first to sort of take all this together and say, okay, here's our base of knowledge that we can start with. So in 1896, in June, he goes to the dunes with his assistants and began with gliders, based on Lilienthal's batwing design. So Chanute considered this weight shifting method way too dangerous and believed that an airplane must be automatically stable. That is, once it flies, whether the wind hits it one way or another, it should be able to automatically right itself so that you can safely fly the thing. And it should only be able to change direction if the pilot says so. So he started experimenting, and then a reporter from the Chicago Tribune showed up the next day, apparently tipped off, and an article appeared on page 1 called "Men Fly Midair." So immediately the press was alerted to all this, and I have a copy of the headline there from the Tribune on the slide here. So they discarded this monoplane design of Lilienthal and then tried a model with multiple wings, which they called the Katydid. There's a picture of that there. So they experimented with 2 weeks with different wing configurations to find one that would provide enough lift and be stable. So they tried as many as 12 wings, stacked on top of each other, one in front of the other, like in a tandem formation. In the picture here, there are no wings in the front. There are 4 wings above the pilot in the middle, and there are 2 wings, including a tail in the back. So that's the configuration that's in the picture here. But he experimented with all different kinds of wing configurations, different numbers of wings. So they found the Katydid to be more stable, but also very difficult to control. So they came back to the dunes in August with a triplane featuring, again, his Pratt truss design. So if you see the last image in the bottom right, that's the third airplane that they worked with. So it started as a triplane, but they took the bottom wing off because it kept digging into the sand, so it became a biplane. And for the first time, they took the 2 wings and trussed them together just like a bridge. Exactly the same Pratt truss as he'd used on the Hannibal Bridge. The same Pratt truss design you see on the Wright Flyer here. So with this aircraft, with the cruciform tail behind it that Herring designed, they were able to make stable, controlled flights of up to 10 seconds covering 250 feet over the dunes. So for a moment at least, in the summer of 1896, the Chanute Herring glider here, this biplane, was the most advanced flying machine in the world. So Chanute remarked in 1899 that it is safe to say that the flying machine of the 20th century will be analogous to a sailing vessel with an auxiliary propeller. It is the soaring of the condor, not the flapping of the sparrow, that must be taken as the model. So in other words, he's saying, no more ornithopters, no more flapping wings. We should have a fixed-wing aircraft and base that as our design. So Chanute and Herring made over 700 glider flights with his biplane here through 1897, and then presented the results before the Western Society of Engineers here in Chicago. He became the clearinghouse of aviation, sharing all this information with anybody who had interest, including two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who wrote to him in 1900. See how I did? See what I did there?
If you get thirsty, your drink up here.
Oh, sweet, thank you. There's my Wright Brothers. There we go. All right, Wright Brothers. Here's where the end of the picture in 1900. So Wilbur Wright wrote a letter to Octave Chanute in May of 1900, writing, "For some years I have been afflicted with the belief that flight is possible to man. My disease is increased in severity, and I feel that it will soon cost me an increased amount of money, if not my life. I have been trying to arrange my affairs in such a way that I can devote my entire time for a few months to experiment in this field." So Chanute's response: "I shall be glad to have you call on me. I intend to make further experiments myself. If you do not expect to come to Chicago soon, I shall be pleased to correspond with you further." So, a very welcome introduction from Chanute. So, Octave Chanute advised Wilbur Wright to find a sandy place that would allow for soft landings and strong prevailing winds to provide the means for lift. So, Chicago had the strongest winds, but the Wright brothers really wanted secrecy. You know, Chanute was very willing to share his results with the public, but the Wright brothers wanted to conduct the experiments much more secretly without the press being involved. So based on Chanute's experiments with the Tribune showing up in 1896, Wilbur Wright decided to avoid a site near an urban area. So if it weren't for the press, if it weren't for Chicago being such a big city, the Wright brothers absolutely would have come to Chicago and experimented on the dunes, because that's where Chanute was. That's where their best friend was, where their collaborator was. It would have made sense, but they wanted to keep things secret. So Chanute suggested a number of locations. I think he suggested San Diego, Daytona Beach, Florida, but ultimately the Wright brothers wrote the Weather Service to ask for what's the place that has the most amount of wind that has sand. And they came back with a whole long list, and they basically arbitrarily chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So there's this, ongoing sort of battle back and forth between the state of Ohio, where I'm from, and North Carolina over where did the first flight take place. It's like, okay, it took place first in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but all the work, all the research, everything was done in Dayton, Ohio. So they're North Carolina, whatever. So,
What about Chicago, though?
well, yes.
Weren't they the first one?
Well, Chicago's where Chanute was from, and he conducted his experiments here. So if you're right, if it wasn't for Chanute's experiments in Chicago, the Wright brothers would not have been made aware of it, and they probably wouldn't have even took up the challenge to start with. Yes. So the Wright brothers then, they thus began their experiments in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, with their 1900 glider, pictured on the slide here, flown as a kite, to start off with. So this is when they started experimenting with the technique of warping the wings, the wing warping technique, in order to roll the airplane in flight to achieve controlled turns. So the story goes that when Wilbur was in his bicycle shop in Dayton, talking with a customer, he would take a cardboard box and just idly twist it back and forth like this. And you notice that when you twist it, one side goes up and the other side goes down. And you thought, maybe if we can make the wing do that, we can try to make one wing go up and the other wing dip down. And this way we can have the wing, or the entire plane, roll in flight. So that's what they experimented with in 1900 with this first glider, their kite. So Chanute was intrigued by these experiments and actually visited them in Dayton in 1901 and was invited to their camp in Kitty Hawk that summer. So in 1901, their new model was not going well, and the Wrights were considering abandoning these experiments altogether. So Chanute intervened and asked Wilbur to come to Chicago to address the Western Society of Engineers. So Wilbur came and he gave a speech, and it was received very enthusiastically. And then Chanute invited him over to his home in Chicago, which was on Dearborn Street, I believe, North Dearborn, in the River North neighborhood. And after this little chat, that renewed Wilbur's spirits and convinced him that it was worthwhile to continue. So for all practical purposes, this was really the breakthrough that they needed, and I'm very glad that Chanute invited them to Chicago, because otherwise they might have just given up right there and then. So at this point in the winter of 1901, Wilbur and Orville returned to Dayton and proceeded to make aviation history. They discarded these lift tables that Lilienthal had made that they had used and instead designed their own wind tunnel to measure the lift and drag from different airfoil shapes. They decided to add a rudder to the rear that you can see in the 1902 glider, and they linked the mechanism that warped the wings with the turning of the rudder. And this is the crucial innovation that gave them the first practical control system to actually turn the aircraft. So with these innovations, the 1902 glider was a huge improvement from 1901, which they then felt confident enough to design an engine with the help of their mechanic, add an engine to the plane, add a propeller, attach a propeller to it, to finally produce the first powered aircraft. I should also mention that the Wright brothers also invented the propeller. Like I said before, every propeller that was used in these experiments before them were really nothing more than ship's paddles, just not nearly effective enough to generate any sort of thrust for the plane. But they reasoned that a propeller is just nothing more than a wing turned on its side, and instead of producing lift vertically, it will now produce thrust in a horizontal manner. So they took the exact same wing shape that they've been working with and fashioned a propeller out of it. And in so doing, they invented the modern propeller. And I think people have done experiments with the Wright propeller and showed that compared to a modern efficient one, or a modern propeller, it's basically like 70% efficient. They almost nailed it on their first attempt. So, Chanute visited them in November of 1903, but because of the weather, they left a month before the Wrights attempted to fly their 1903 flyer. So he was at home in Chicago on December 17, 1903, when he received a very historic telegram by telegraph from their sister Catherine Wright, which said that the boys have done it. 4 successful flights today, longest flight 57 seconds. Doesn't sound like much, but 57 seconds over 120 feet was the very first powered, controlled flight in history. And for a while, he was the only one outside the family that even knew about the Wright success. So at this point, I'm going to have to take a little bit of a tangent here and just kind of address this, because every time you say the Wright brothers were the first to fly, there's always a whole bunch of naysayers that got to say, well, you know, this person or that person first flew, and the Wright brothers didn't really fly. So here's the thing. They achieved the first flight, and there has to be some qualifiers here. First flight of a piloted, powered, controllable, heavier than air flying machine. So of course I'm biased because I'm from Ohio, and there's just nothing Ohioans that are more proud of than the Wright brothers. But so piloted, first flight of an aircraft that had a pilot on board. Powered, meaning it's not a glider. Controllable, meaning the pilot actually has control over the aircraft and can turn it the way he wants to. And heavier than air, meaning that it's not a hot air balloon, a blimp, or a dirigible. So, you know, people have been flying blimps and dirigibles since 1850. There was the Montgolfier brothers in France. They were the first to take to the air in a hot air balloon back in the 1780s. But the Wright brothers were the first, really. What they unquestionably came up with first was the first control system for the aircraft. And that's what they invented first, that's what they patented first successfully, and that's what they defended for the rest of their lives. So, if anyone says anyone flew before them, so the arguments, there's actually this whole cottage industry of people who claim that that other experimenters flew before the Wright brothers. And from what I can tell, they all kind of hinge on a really fast and loose definition of the word flight and a definition of the word plane. So there's lots of people who had plane-like objects that would roll on the ground and lift up into the air and then settle back down again after 100 feet. So if you consider that a flight, then sure, other people flew before the Wright brothers. But I think most people say what the Wright brothers were interested in was not just lifting up in the air, but what they wanted was a practical machine that people could use. Meaning, you can lift off, you can turn wherever you want to, come back to the place you started and land again. So they weren't, unlike Chanute. Chanute wanted to spread his information about flying to everyone. The Wright brothers were businessmen. They wanted to invent a practical machine that people could use, that they could patent, and then sell as a business. That's what they wanted to do, and that's what they did. So there. So after the successful flight, the relationship between the Wrights and Chanute became a little bit strained. So Chanute believed in, like I said, in sharing information with other experimenters, whereas the Wrights really wanted to keep these discoveries secrets. So in 1905, they made some refinements. They came back to Dayton. They continued to experiment. I think they did come back to Katy once, but for all practical purposes, they did the rest of their experiments in Dayton, Ohio. So they perfected their Wright Flyer in 1905 with the Wright Flyer 3, which for all practical purposes, that's the first practical airplane, the 1905 Flyer. and that one is still in Dayton. If you're ever in Dayton, check it out. It's very cool. It's still hanging there. So this plane could take off. They could fly in complete circles. They could do figure eights, and they could stay in the air as long as they wanted to, as long as they had fuel, basically. So they basically nailed it at that point. And at that point, that's when they stopped for 3 years to work on securing their patent for the wing warping method of control, which they did and fought successfully in court against rival Glenn Curtiss. So Glenn Curtiss also worked on airplanes at the same time up in Hammondsport, New York. He also had a wing warping method, but the Wrights said, nope, we got this first, you've got to stop. So Chanute believed to his death that the Wrights were basically his pupils and that he had partially subsidized them and that the wing warping technique had actually predated them. The Wrights, of course, did not agree with this. So it was a big thing, like, was there a feud, was there not a feud? If you actually look at the letters between them and you actually read the original letters in their handwriting, it wasn't really a feud. It was more of like a professional dispute. You know, the Wright brothers wanted to go one way. They wanted to, you know, patent their machine and make a business out of it and keep their inventions to themselves and take credit for it. And Chanute wanted this information to be shared with everyone. I don't think Chanute ever actually patented anything. He just, you know, he was already independently wealthy, so he didn't really feel the need to. So they were just kind of going in different directions professionally, is the way I see it. So in the end, Chanute did not see an airplane fly until 1908, which is when Orville Wright demonstrated his airplane, or their airplane, to the U.S. Army Signal Corps at Fort Myer, Virginia. Wilbur at the time was in France demonstrating the Wright Flyer Model A for a European group that was interested in purchasing the rights to manufacture the plane in Europe. So when when Wilbur flew in France, these flights absolutely astonished the French. So the French for 120 years thought that they were in the lead in aviation because they'd flown first in the 1780s, the Montgolfier brothers, right? So they thought there was no way the two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who came from nothing, could have possibly beaten us. But as soon as Wilbur Wright showed up in 1908 and flew circles over these guys with, you know, effortless control, they knew not only had the Wright brothers beaten them, they had absolutely done everything they said they had done back in 1903. A headline later in French read "Nous sommes battus," which means we are beaten. So, yep. Yep, the French not known for their humility, but this time they were beaten. They were beaten bad. So Chanute died in 1910, at which point the feud between Chanute and the Wright brothers had been buried. Wilbur Wright noted after his death, quote, "In patience and goodness and heart he has rarely been surpassed. Few men were more universally respected or loved." So much for the feud. So that kind of closes the story on Chanute and the Wright brothers. So now we're in 1910, and so now we're going to shift our attention back to Chicago with a very important group called the Aero Club of Illinois. Shifting slides. So the Aero Club of Illinois, it opened in 1910 with Octave Chanute as its first president, just before he died. They were formed to promote aviation in Chicago through aviation meets and to encourage aviators to learn how to fly. So pilots that they trained included some very notable people here. Chance Vaught, who created the Vaught Corporation, who built some of the military's most famous aircraft, including the Navy carrier fighter, the F-4U Corsair. They trained Glenn Curtiss, the Wright brothers' rival, who used Chicago as his base before World War I. They also trained Catherine Stinson. So Catherine Stinson, she was the fourth woman to earn a pilot's license, and she was the first woman to fly the United States Mail, and the first woman to perform the loop-the-loop maneuver, which is where you pull back on the stick and you do a big loop. So this was all despite the instructor initially refusing to teach her because she was a woman, but she was able to solo in the Wright Model B after only 4 hours of instruction. Pretty incredible. I've actually flown a simulator of the Wright Model B, and it's just so difficult. It's completely different than modern aircraft controls, but like I could barely fly this thing to save my life. So the fact that she could master it in 4 hours is just incredible to me. So her family founded the Stinson Aircraft Company as well as their own airport and flying school after moving to San Antonio. So some of the Aero Club's members included their founder, Harold McCormick. So Harold McCormick was Cyrus McCormick's son. Cyrus McCormick was the founder of the International Harvester Company, and he invented the mechanical reaper. So he succeeded Chanute as Chicago's most important person in aviation. He put up his own money to build Chicago's first airport, which was called Cicero Field, out in West Suburban Cicero. The person who succeeded him in the Aero Club was Charles Pop Dickinson. Let's call him Pop for short. So he directed the Aero Club after McCormick moved on to other interests. He was a wealthy seed company owner who kept Chicago's aviation community alive until the development of the airmail routes finally made aviation a viable industry. So he attempted the first nonstop airline between Chicago and New York in 1924. So back then, the standard was the luxurious, Broadway Limited and the 20th Century Limited train for the New York Central and the Penn Central, respectively. Sorry, I think Broadway was Pennsylvania, and the 20th Century was New York Central. So that was the standard at the time. So he said, quote, that I may never make a cent out of this, but I do not care. My only wish is to see Chicago become the center of American flying. They also had the Lockheed Brothers, who went on to form the Lockheed Corporation. They had William B. Stout. So William Stout was from Quincy, Illinois. After Chicago, he joined the Packard Company in Detroit and helped design the Liberty engine used in World War I. With Henry Ford's backing, he established the first freight airline between Detroit and Grand Rapids. And after Henry Ford bought the company, Stout designed the famous Ford Trimotor, which was America's first successful commercial passenger airliner. It was called the Tin Goose, as opposed to the Model T, which was the Tin Lizzie. Yep. So the Stout Airlines actually was one of, I think, 4 or 5 airlines that all came together to eventually form United Airlines, based in Chicago, of course. Matty Laird, interesting guy. So Matty Laird, another member of the Aero Club, he was one of the first few pilots who actually built his own aircraft. So at the time, the only ones available to you were a Wright model or a Curtiss model. So he decided to build his own. So he actually built his own company, the Laird Airplane Company. I think I have a picture of his the advertisement from that company there. It was based at, it says 4500 West 83rd Street. So that is the Ashburn neighborhood in Chicago.
South side.
Yeah, southwest side, Ashburn. So back in the day, that was the site of Chicago's second airport, Ashburn Field, after Cicero Field. So it is located near Ford City Mall, which incidentally, Ford City Mall used to be a factory which built the engines for the B-29 bomber for World War II.
Wow.
Yeah. So after, the Laird Airplane Company was based there at Ashburn Field from 1915 to 1919. At which point he moved all of his operations to Wichita, Kansas, in the year 1919, which helped turn that particular city into the center for small general aviation aircraft such as Cessna and Beechcraft. So Laird, he built the racer used by Jimmy Doolittle to win the 1931 Bendix Cross Country race from Burbank to Cleveland. You might know Jimmy Doolittle from the Doolittle Raider fame. World War II, after the Pearl Harbor attacks, if you don't know, Jimmy Doolittle organized sort of a sneak attack on Tokyo using B-25 Mitchell bombers off a Navy aircraft carrier. It was the first, I think the only time that Army planes have been flown off of a Navy aircraft carrier for an attack, because that was literally the only planes they had at the time that could execute such an attack. So it was the first response after Pearl Harbor. So that was what made Jimmy Doolittle famous. But before that, he was a racer. So the Bendix Trophy was it was a race, a cross-country race that went from usually Los Angeles, California, to wherever the air races were held that year. So the national air races were held from 1920 all the way up to World War II. Most of them were in Cleveland, Ohio. 2 were in Chicago, 1930 and 1933. I'll mention that a little bit later. So there was the Bendix cross-country race. Whoever could get from Burbank, California to either Chicago or Cleveland first would win that. And then the second one was the Thompson Trophy races, which was a closed course pylon race. You had to race around these pylons as fast as you could go. Roscoe Turner won that race in 1938 and 39, also in Cleveland, also using Laird's plane. So Roscoe Turner, he's a pretty flamboyant guy. So he had this rakish mustache that was just really dapper, and he flew with a pet lion named Gilmore. Have you ever seen the movie The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio? There's a brief scene where he's being interviewed, where he's holding his pet lion, and the guy's like, "Oh, how do you do, Mr. Thompson?" He's like, "I'm Roscoe Turner. Don't you know who I am?" It's pretty funny. So, needless to say, the Aero Club of Illinois produced many of the industry's movers and shakers in the years after World War I. So flying exhibitions. That was, like I said, that was really the only way you could make money if you wanted to be an aviator in the early history of aviation. So other inventors after the Wright Brothers, after Glenn Curtiss, took to design their own models. So armies of the world had also expressed interest in the airplane, which is why Orville demonstrated their machine in Fort Myer in 1908 But that market really wouldn't develop until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. So in Chicago, as elsewhere, there were a handful of tinkerers that attempted to emulate the Wright success. So only one of 12 inventors in Chicago who obtained a patent between 1900 and 1910 ever produced an airplane capable of even a modest flight. So the first documented flight in the Chicago area was in 1909 when Glenn Curtis came to town, flying a biplane for a quarter of a mile over the Hawthorne racetrack in Cicero. He had won the Gordon Bennett Cup previous year in France and was on a national tour to demonstrate his airplane. So the first flight in Chicago itself was a huge event. The publisher of the Chicago Times-Herald offered a $10,000 prize for the first person to fly from Chicago to Springfield. So a 21-year-old aviation buff named Walter Brookins, whom the Wrights had hired and trained, took up Chanute's advice and accepted the challenge. On September 27th, 1910, a crowd of 200,000 people jammed into Grant Park for a demonstration flight with a reporter on board, the first recorded airplane passenger in Chicago. The Springfield flight occurred 2 days later and was the first of Chicago's many aviation spectacles until World War I put an end to exhibition flying. Wilbur Wright actually himself came out from Dayton to inspect the plane. Brookins would fly above, his plan was to fly above the Illinois Central Railroad, which at the time was the common way you would navigate, because there was no aerial navigation aids at the time. You had to fly over landmarks on the ground, which usually meant flying over railroads. So he successfully flew all the way to Springfield with multiple stops along the way for fuel in 5 hours and 49 minutes, which was 10 minutes less than the train. So the Aero Club of Illinois then, at this point, met at the Chicago Athletics Association downtown and proposed a big air show in 1911. Harold McCormick, the founder of the club, put up $80,000 of his own money to serve as the prize money. So the issue was the Wright Brothers. So at this point, I love me some Wright Brothers, but at this point they get all lawsuity. So 1910, yeah. So again, at this point, the Wright Brothers, they had their patent for the wing warping technology, and they planned to enforce it. So they wanted $10,000 up front to license the event, plus $100 a day from each flyer that used a plane that used ailerons. So an aileron it's a slat in a wing that goes up and down, which is still used today, which helps the aircraft roll this way back and forth. So it's essentially the successor to the wing warping technique. But the Wright Brothers believed, regardless of the technique, any changing of the shape of the wing that you used to control the plane was underneath their patents, which is every single airplane. Every plane today has ailerons. Okay, like even the United Dreamliner here has got ailerons on it, so it can roll this way and roll that way. So they believe basically that every airplane thenceforth would be under their patent and they should be owed money because of that. They get the credit for inventing it, but they might have gone a little bit too far in this respect, because obviously, really, this whole battle between Glenn Curtis and the Wright Brothers really held back American aviation all the way through World War I. And unfortunately, when World War I did break out, there were no American airplanes to speak of, really, that were used. All the planes that were flown by the Americans in World War I were French and English planes. So, where was I? Unfortunately, yes. The Wright Brothers, because of their litigiousness, kind of held back American aviation. But they didn't care. They wanted the credit, and they wanted for the airplane, and they got the patent. They planned to use it. So in the end, the Aero Club called their bluff and did not pay them the $10,000. So they assumed that not even the Wright Brothers would boycott the event because of the prize money. So in the end, they did file a lawsuit, they didn't pursue it, and they did send their own team of flyers to the event. So for 9 days in August of 1911, the aviation world was really centered in Chicago. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Grant Park to watch the day's events, which included a flight duration contest, a 4-mile race over the lake, and altitude competitions. Somewhat ominously, they also drew an outline of a battleship on the ground, which the pilots could bomb with flour bags. Yeah, good practice. There were also many mishaps, as the planes generally flew pretty slow and low to the ground, so that if there were crashes, most of the pilots were able to survive them. However, there were 2 fatalities. Lincoln Beachey, who I've got a picture of here at the air show, was the star of the show. He earned more prize money than any other aviator, with $11,000. He set the world altitude record of 11,600 feet on the last day, which would hold for 3 years, flying a Curtiss airplane. His method of getting as high as you could was to use every drop of fuel in the engine to get the plane as high as possible, wait for the engine to completely die, and then just glide down after that. And then hopefully land safely. The other world records that were set at this event were for the 2-man duration at 3 hours and 42 minutes, and for climbing speed, which was 1,600 feet in 3.5 minutes. Both of those were done in French-built Blériot planes. Blériot, incidentally, was the first person to cross the English Channel by plane. So at this point, the French were kind of catching up. So the meet itself, unfortunately, was a financial failure. The Aero Club lost $11,000 in the event. They held air shows in Grant Park every year, all the way up to 1915. However, in the absence of government interest in aviation, the Aero Club of Illinois really held the dominant position for the next 10 years, setting the rules of how to fly, building the airports, and training the pilots how to fly. And like I said, Chicago, after that, hosted 2 more aviation meets. The National Air Races in 1930, which was held up at Curtis Reynolds Field. Curtis Reynolds Field was up in Glenview. That became the Glenview Naval Air Station. So at the Glenview Naval Air Station, there was a young pilot named George H.W. Bush who received his carrier landing training there. They also hosted the International Air Races in 1933 as part of the Century of Progress World's Fair. That was held at Municipal Airport, which is now Midway. So speaking of Midway, let's dovetail off into Chicago airports. So the reason, like I said, Chicago was able to attract the top aviators from around the country was because of their first airport that they built in Cicero. So Harold McCormick built that airport out of his own money. That was really the first public airport in the country, along with the flying schools. So at the time, airports were privately owned. They were privately owned flying fields. And whoever owned the flying field could let you use it or not, up to them. But this was a public airfield, so you could use it and you could get your training there. So the city of Chicago really did not get involved with airports until the 1920s, when they realized that they would need one to handle the airmail business, which was developing at the time. But anybody could come to Cicero and learn how to fly or fix airplanes, which was really true to the legacy of its first president, Octave Chanute, who encouraged anyone to learn about the wonders of flying machines. So Chicago ceased to become a major center for aircraft manufacturing after World War I, but rather became a hub of transportation itself, as it had been before for Great Lakes shipping and the canals and the railroads. So why were there no airports in the city, at least initially? So in 1919, there was a blimp called the Wingfoot Air Express, which was a non-rigid airship, or blimp, built by the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio, where I lived for 5 years. So that was in town, transporting people from Grant Park to the White City Amusement Park down the south side. So at the time, blimps were filled with hydrogen, very flammable. So you can probably guess what happened. Kaboom! Hydrogen catches on fire. Happened to catch on fire right over downtown Chicago. And it ended up crashing into the Illinois Trust and Savings Building, killing 13 people.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So kind of a prequel for the Hindenburg, which would occur in 1937, which decidedly brought a very dramatic end to the era of the dirigibles. So Grant Park at the time was actually being used as an airfield, first for those early air shows starting in 1911, and then for flying the mail after that. If you can imagine Grant Park completely devoid of any structures other than airplanes. Pretty crazy. But this crash put an end to the idea of flying aircraft in and out of the downtown area, at least until Meigs Field. So Meigs Field was built in 1948 on Daniel Burnham's Island, which was meant to be a nature preserve for the enjoyment of all. So, fortunately, that's reverted back to its original purpose. Thanks, Mayor Daley.
When did Meigs close?
Meigs closed very dramatically in 2003, I believe. And if you're not familiar with the story, Mayor Daley really wanted that airport gone. So, in true Chicago fashion, he sent out the bulldozers overnight, and they carved these 2 huge X's into the runway. So, the very next day, Meigs Field was no more. And I think the city was fined the FAA minimum amount of money, something like $35,000 for improperly decommissioning an airport in like the most dramatic, screw you way imaginable. But that put an end to Meigs Field. So now it's back to being a nature reserve, as it was originally intended. So it wasn't long after airplanes began carrying the mail profitably that people first began going along for the ride as passengers. So 1955 was the year that the airlines pulled even with the railroads and the ocean liners for passengers, and really never looked back after that. So Chicago had won the competition for canals and railroads in the 1850s, and they were certainly not about to be left out of the race for the air, and became a hub for passenger aviation as it had been for the railroads. So just a quick summary of the airports. So the first one, like I said, was Cicero Field. That was the first public airport in the country. That survived for 3 years, training pilots, until the land was sold off. After which Pop Dickinson, who I mentioned earlier, he stepped in and financed Chicago's second airport, Ashburn Field, on the southwest side, where Matty Laird had his factory in 1915. After that, the third airport was Checkerboard Field, which was located in suburban Maywood, which opened in 1918 to compete with Ashburn Field, and they operated the very first airmail line, until that service was transferred to Municipal Airport in 1928, which is now Midway. So it was called Checkerboard Field because there was a company that actually used it as a shipping center, and they had a checkerboard pattern on their tails. So Checkerboard Field. There was a young pilot named Charles Lindbergh who started his career there, flying the mail between Chicago and St. Louis. There was another African American woman named Bessie Coleman. She is from the south side of Chicago also. She was the very first African American woman to earn a pilot's license. She flew her first air show at Checkerboard Field in 1922. She was sponsored by Robert Abbott, who ran the Chicago Defender, a very important newspaper in Brownsville on the south side that advocated for African Americans. Checkerboard Field is no more. It is now a forest preserve park. So on the last slide here, I've got a picture of the plaque that's located there that honors the airmail pioneers that first flew there. And you got Bessie Coleman right next to that as well. Yep. And to round out Chicago's major airfields, there was an orchard on the northwest side of Chicago that actually became a factory for the Douglas Aircraft Company in 1942 during World War II. They named it Orchard Place Airport / Douglas Field. In that very same year, there was a lieutenant from Chicago named Butch O'Hare who was shot down defending his aircraft carrier to Lexington, and the city renamed the airport after him. But they kept the initials ORD, so Orchard, ORD, Place Field. That's where it comes from, if anyone ever asks you. So, ORD, Orchard. Today, still the busiest airport in the world by number of flights. I think Atlanta's passed it in terms of number of passengers, but by number of flights, O'Hare is still the busiest, at least in the country, if not the world.
Even with all the winter.
Yep. I think it's because of all the regional jets coming in and out that they exceed Atlanta in terms of number of flights. So just to bring everything back full circle to wrap things up. So in 1917, the Army built a base in Rantoul, Illinois, near Urbana-Champaign, where the University of Illinois is. Yeah. The base trained no less than 8 aces from Chicago who served in World War II and Korea, and in 1941, the first all-black fighter squadron was activated there, which was the first unit that became the famed Tuskegee Airmen. So if you're not familiar, there's a movie called Red Tails. I highly recommend you watch it. That's all about the Tuskegee Airmen. They flew a fighter escort for the B-17 bombers in World War II. And Robert Abbott, the Chicago Defender, claimed that they never lost a single bomber. It's not quite true. They did lose a couple, but they were very successful at fighter escort during World War II. Didn't get the recognition until much later. So they got their start at Rantoul, Illinois, at that Air Force base. The name of the airfield at that base, Chanute Field.
Oh,
In honor of Chicago's aviation pioneer.
nice.
So with that, thank you very much for coming. Questions, comments? Yep. I think I see a hand back there.
Yes, would you be able to talk a little bit more about, kind of concurrently what like the English and French development cycle looked like in the early days?
So, right, so the question was, what were the English and French doing at the same time as the Wright Brothers and Glenn Curtiss? Right, so like I said, the Wright Brothers and Glenn Curtiss were engaged in the start of this patent battle after the Wrights got their patent in 1905. So between 1905 and 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, there really wasn't much progress to be made in American aviation. The Wrights had basically locked into their design, as had Glenn Curtiss. The French were making all kinds. So basically, at that point, the French and English saw what the Wright brothers had done and said, "Okay, that's the technique. We have to have wing warping. That's the last key to the puzzle." What the French were doing before then were really their method was: we're going to forget about steering. We're just going to put the most powerful engine that we can find on our plane, and that should generate enough lift, and we'll just worry about the steering later. So once they figured out how to do the wing warping technique that the Wright brothers invented, they basically were able to take the lead after that. So you had guys like Louis Blériot, who was the first to cross the English Channel. You also had Henri Farman. You also had the Voisin brothers. So there's a bunch of French experimenters who all took the lead in developing the biplanes that would eventually be used in World War I. The English, they had de Havilland. So de Havilland made a bunch of famous airplanes that were used in World War One. I'm trying to think. There's the Curtiss Jenny. So Curtiss also made aircraft that were used later in World War One. And after the war was over, the Curtiss Jenny, the JN4, was used for trainers. So there's all these like surplus aircraft that were generated after World War One. So if you wanted to get into aviation in the 20s, after the war, you had to use a Curtiss Jenny because there was just so many of them. They were very reliable. So, so the American kind of took a back seat to the French and English for a while, but then once the 20s got going, then it was off to the races. Yeah.
Questions?
So why do you think Chanute was so overlooked? Because he wasn't as litigious as the other guys and, wanted to share stuff? And
Right. So why was Octave Chanute overlooked? Why is he not really a household name compared with the Wright brothers?
Yeah.
Well, he only flew gliders. He never attempted a powered flight. He never tried to patent anything. He was content to experiment with gliders, and whatever he discovered, he was very happy to share that with everybody. So, which is to be commended, for sure. The Wright brothers absolutely would not have gotten anywhere near where they gotten so quickly if it wasn't for Chanute's innovations, like the trussed biplane technique. They absolutely took that from Chanute. Chanute encouraged them. He encouraged everyone. But, I think everyone kind of keys on like the first person to do anything, right? Like who cares who the second person to fly is, right? So, the Wright brothers were the first, so they became a household name. And Chanute, he really didn't make much of a splash in the aviation world much after, because he died in 1910. So really, it was only 7 years after the first flight that Chanute died. And because he didn't really pursue the airplane much beyond the stage of gliders, that's probably why his innovations weren't really widely known, unless you were sort of a student of that early era. Yeah. But he absolutely should be credited.
Why aren't we aware of Grant Park? That is the first I've ever heard that
Right.
Grant Park was an airfield.
Sure, and if you look at this picture, you see that, the 1911 air show right over Grant Park. It's pretty mind-blowing to see that there's really nothing there, because at the time, Grant Park wasn't really a public park. It was really more of a rail yard for the Illinois Central. So you had all this open land, so it made sense to use it to stage that first air show. But because it was so close to downtown and the lake was right there, you had all these winds, it was just really not practical to have an airport there. But they did use it as a flying field.
Did they have any other shows anywhere else?
Anywhere else?
Yeah, they must have.
Other than the 1930 and the 1933 air shows, those were like the two big ones. I think there was probably smaller air shows
Oh, really?
after 1915. But World War I kind of put a stop to all that.
We have a question from an internet viewer.
Okay.
Sarah wants to know,
Mm-hmm.
what about the letter from Chanute to the Wright brothers mentioning Gustav Whitehead?
Aha. So, Sarah's my girlfriend. She's from Connecticut. So, I am not shocked at all she brought up Gustav Whitehead. I was hoping I wouldn't have to mention Gustav Whitehead. All right. So, Gustav Whitehead is from Connecticut. He was one of those hundreds of experimenters that were also working on airplanes at the time. So, there's a whole cottage industry of people who think that Gustav Whitehead had the first powered air flight before the Wright brothers. So, it's all based on hearsay. There's all these articles that have come up that people have researched that said this person after the fact swears to God that when they were 5 years old they saw Gustav Whitehead making a flight in Connecticut or making a flight in Pittsburgh. But there's no photograph today that shows a powered Gustav Whitehead plane in flight anywhere. Now, if one were to service, that would be amazing. That would totally change things. If that predated the Wright brothers. But if you look at pictures of Gustav Whitehead's airplane, you can tell he was definitely not on the right track, which is not a slight on Gustav Whitehead whatsoever. Literally everybody else was also taking a shot in the dark with their experiments, not knowing what would work, what didn't work. So he had a bat-winged aircraft, kind of similar to the Lilienthal type. He had, again, paddles for propellers instead of a modern propeller design. So he was definitely going down an aviation dead end. It would not have worked. So whether he's able to make a short hop in the air like other people were able to, we don't know. Some people say that they saw him do this, but it's clear to me that looking at the design that there's no way this thing would have worked. Okay. Now, if a photograph turns up disproving this, I'd be, very glad to see that, and I'd be the first to say, sure, they beat the Wright brothers. But so far, that is not the case. So, and ultimately, whatever he did, it didn't make an impact. A lot of these other people that were experimenting, they didn't make a lasting impact on what the airplane ended up looking like. The Gustav Whitehead's plane is pretty far from this, okay? Whereas you can kind of draw a direct line from the Wright Flyer here to the modern airplane. It's got wings. It's got an elevator in the front. It's got a rudder in the back. It's got a control system so it can turn. It has everything that modern plane has. So, she's gonna really not be happy with me. Just telling you like it is. Yep.
What about safety and regulation? Talk to me a little bit about what you know about the establishment of the FAA and how that impacted things.
Yep. So the question was airplane safety and the development of the FAA. So the government didn't really get involved in aviation until the 20s, and their first interest was in flying the mail. So so that was their first interest in aviation at all. Safety was really not a huge concern at the time, as you can tell. So the predecessor to the FAA, I believe, was the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB. So the airlines were very heavily regulated under the CAB, but their main interest was controlling what airline would fly where. So kind of like the railroads were really heavily regulated as well. So they would, if you wanted to open a new line or close another line, you had to get permission from the government to do so. So ultimately, there was 4 airlines that emerged, the big 4, which were United Airlines, Eastern Airlines, TWA, Trans World Airlines, and what was the 4th one? Pan Am, thank you, Pan Am. So it was kind of like the CAB basically had this it was basically the big 4. So you had sort of a monopoly, and each airline had carved out its own niche of the country. So you had to go through the CAB if you wanted to add a line here or move a line over there. So their interest was more in making sure there's like a monopoly in each part of the country. As far as safety regulations goes, I think it kind of gradually evolved over time. If you read these stories, like for example with stewardesses, when they first brought stewardesses or flight attendants on board aircraft, they were essentially nurses because it was just so dangerous. Planes were flying underneath the weather, so it was just bumpy as hell. People would get sick all the time. And again, airlines first profitably flew the mail before passengers. So there's kind of this transitionary period where they would fly the mail and then they would also bring passengers on board. So you would have to sign this thing that said, if we land somewhere and it's more profitable for us to pick up the mail than fly passengers, we will just kick you off this airplane. And you got to take the train the rest of the way. And that happened all the time. So the stewardesses who were nurses would just get kicked off flights and they'd just be stranded. So that's a thing that airlines could do at the time. And then gradually carrying passengers. See, planes got the general trend was for planes to get longer, bigger, more powerful. They could fly with more passengers for a higher and longer amount of time. So then, at that point, carrying the passengers became profitable, and then the airlines started catering to people. So at the time, it was still incredibly expensive to fly in an airplane. People still would prefer to fly or take the railroads or to take ships. So it was really catering to the wealthy, and that's when they start pulling out all the stops with, like meals and China, and if you look at all this memorabilia that these planes had, it was very luxurious at the time because they were trying to compete with the Pullman cars. So at that point, I think that's when the safety became more of a concern. And,
what year was that?
That would be, probably 1920s and 30s is when passenger service started to really take off, pun intended. Again, catering to the rich people. It did become really, the prices didn't really drop and become more affordable to regular people until after the Second World War. So as more people took to the skies, then people started clamoring for more comfort, like they would expect on the railroads. And then I think that's when the government stepped in and said, okay, we need to institute safety features like seat belts, and you can't just kick people off airplanes, right, whenever you want to. So
Thank you.
yeah, kind of a gradual evolution there.
We have another online question from Micah. Were the 1910s to 30s air shows precursors to the Air and Water Show, or was that a later development?
Well, I'm not sure about the Chicago Air and Water Show. So the national air races, like I said, between 1920 and the Second World War, most of those were held in Cleveland. So I can tell you that the Cleveland Air Show, which I believe started in the 60s after a hiatus, is absolutely a direct descendant of the national air races. So because they were centered. So Cleveland's probably as important as Chicago in the history of aviation for that reason. Chicago's air show, every city's got like an air show, right? So I think most cities' air shows can trace like their origins back to these early air shows. So because back in the 19-teens, it was pure spectacle. People showed up because this was just something mind-blowing to them to see an airplane fly and do the loop-de-loop and to have people do wing walking and all these crazy stunts. So it was incredibly dangerous. Pilots died all the time in these air shows, and people, it was all about the spectacle. So I would say obviously modern air shows are quite a bit safer, but yes, they definitely, I think, can trace their lineage back to the early ones.
Isn't that how Bessie Coleman did? She died in an air show, like she turned her plane, fell out of it?
Right, so Bessie Coleman, so she asked how Bessie Coleman died. She died in 1927, I believe, in Florida, and what happened was, I think there was a wrench in the airplane that she was using, that was used to repair something, and the wrench just by dumb luck fell into the engine, caused the engine to seize up, and she just crashed.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's just a pure accident. It was nothing. It's not a mistake on her part. It was just a very unfortunate accident. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know that Bessie Coleman and early female aviatrix had to go to France to get trained to be pilots. When were women and black women allowed to get trained in the U.S. to become a pilot?
So the question was, when were women and black women, when were they allowed to be trained as pilots in the United States? So if you were a woman or an African American and you wanted to become a pilot, you really had to do it on your own. There wasn't really any facility that was available to you. It was, because of segregation. Women couldn't even train to be pilots in the military. So the military was another way that you could, where the military reached out to find pilots, and they would bring you in and train you. Women and African Americans couldn't do that either. So of course there was the WASPs, the Women Air Service Pilots that served in World War II that were pilots. They did not serve in combat. There was the Tuskegee Airmen for African Americans, but all these individuals had to learn how to fly on their own. They had to find somebody that'd be willing to teach them. They had to come up with the money to do this. So it wasn't really until, after the Second World War, that's when the African Americans could finally serve in the military and be trained officially as pilots, same as women. I don't think women were allowed to train as fighter pilots until the 70s. So it was, very, very late in coming to be trained as official military pilots. But before that, yeah. So another famous name is Jacqueline Cochran. I should give her a shout out. Jacqueline Cochran was absolutely the most famous female aviator of her day. She still, I think, holds a whole bunch of records. She was behind the WASP. She founded the WASP organization that brought these women together to serve in World War II. And she was actually independently wealthy. She actually had her own cosmetic line, so that's how she was able to make her money. She was also married to a rich dude. So it helps to have money so that you can afford this sort of hobby. So she was able to train herself that way. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Can you touch on the connection between the Navy Pier and aviation? And I think you had a role with training at the time.
Right, Navy Pier. So Navy Pier was. Let's see. I'm trying to think. It was used as for carrier training during World War II. So you had Glenview Naval Air Station up in Glenview. That was training carrier pilots like George H.W. Bush. And there was also carrier training done at Navy Pier as well during the Second World War. And I think to this day, if you can take dives out of Lake Michigan, there's still planes that are crashed and that you can find underneath the water that were part of those training exercises. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for watching and coming. Appreciate it.